Much for having me here tonight. I feel as if I'm the substitute who's come in off the bench to replace the star who wasn't able to make it tonight. As pointed out, I've written a couple of books about dry stone walls. The first one was a decade ago and it was reprinted several times. That sounds a bit braggish, but it got to a point where, talking to the publisher, Wakefield Press, we had to make a decision: do we reprint again, or is there time for a second edition? And I felt that in that time there was a lot more to be said about dry stone walls, a lot of areas which I hadn't explored the first time, so we went for a second edition. So what you're going to see tonight is something you will not have seen before. Nothing that I will be showing you tonight appeared in that first edition, I'm pretty confident, except for that. I did start when I think I have spoken to this group once before, and I showed them this wall, and a few people in the audience immediately recognised it as being, that's right, the road to Victor Harbour, Cut Hill it's called. An amazing wall. It's actually nationally listed. And that wall is about 5 metres high, and it's all dry stone. And by dry stone we mean no mortar. Mortar is a very dirty word. That's sitting on a slope of about 45 degrees, and it's called Cut Hill because all the stone which was used there was actually cut from the hill on the other side of the road. So next time you go to Victor, make sure you pull over and have a look. The reason I've included it, even though I said nothing from the old book is going to be in it, this wall was actually damaged by a car. 2017 ran into the wall and damaged it, and a short time afterwards another car ran into the wall and damaged it. But to the great credit of the Department of Transport, they restored it, fixed it and did it beautifully. And it was all done according to the requirements of the Borough Charter, because this is a listed wall. It was done using the existing stone, which had fallen 5 metres down. 5 tonne of it had to be hauled back up, put back together in the wall, and it needed to look like invisible mending, which it did. So that's an old wall which some of you will have seen before, heard me talk about before, but it's got a bit of a new identity because it has been revisited. Okay, now let's, oh, this is a bit trigger happy. This one is actually in Wollonga. And of course, as was pointed out before, I've now moved to Aldinga, got to know Wollonga quite well. And Wollonga, of course, had a number of slate quarries. This is actually an underwater drainage system under the main street in Wollonga. And it was going to be ripped up until the National Trust in Wollonga got involved and said this is something which should be protected. The bottom is all flagstone, the top is all flagstone, and it's all walled up on the side as well with little flagstones. It's a beautiful piece of work, and it's been kept, the whole drainage system is still functional, and it's been kept as something well worth looking at because it's a piece of beautiful stonework. This is also in Wollonga, and I don't know whether you call this a dry stone wall, but I do. It's a slate tank. And these slate tanks, of course, being Wollonga, lots of slate, good opportunity to make a tank out of that. 4 slabs of slate pulled together with a couple of bolts and sealed, usually with bitumen. And then the same thing with the floor. The slate from Wollonga generally was not particularly regular. Mintaro slate is much flatter, that's what they make pool tables from, but nonetheless they did make a lot of tanks, and you'll still see many of them around in Wollonga, from slate coming from the 4 quarries which existed at the time. Tintara Wines in McLaren Vale actually had something like 23 800-gallon slate tanks for fermentation back in the 1890s. Quite extraordinary. And wonderful pieces of work to actually produce those tanks, and some of them are still collector's items. And this is a modern taste of dry stone walls. This is also on Quarry Road, and all the garden here, is all the retaining walls and revetments have all been built from either stone from the quarry or stone that came from the site when the house was built. And it's a good illustration of this is what you can do with just stone. And all that holds it together, of course, is gravity and friction. It's very, very simple and a very old means of building a wall. Okay, this is what people sometimes think of as being dry stone walls, the things that you see in the landscape. This is Blackwood Park, which is sort of between, what would you say, Macclesfield and Strathalbyn. It was originally John Ratcliffe's property, and he initially settled at Strathalbyn. At one stage there was 14 kilometres of these dry stone walls, 14 kilometres. Now the property is not as big now as it was, but there's still 8 kilometres of dry stone walls in reasonably good condition. Some relics of old sheep yards as well, but the dry stone walls are generally well maintained. And of course, if they've been well built in the first instance, then maintenance is not really too much of a problem. It's interesting, if you take a closer look, and you won't see that tonight, if you take a closer look at these walls, you can often identify their origins. In other words, who built them. In this instance, the walls are very typically Irish. And indeed, the Heritage Report for Meadows indicates that the three wallers who are best known for building walls on this property were O'Grady. I should remember the other two because I'm Irish, but I can't. But anyway, it's in the book. But the walls are very typically Irish, given the stone that they had to work with. Okay, this is moving up the hills a little bit on Red Creek Road. Red Creek Road used to be known as Chauncey's Line, which is a line which was surveyed as the route from Adelaide to Melbourne via Wellington. And this is a property on Red Creek Road. There are a number of ruins very close to the road, including the old post office. This is not the post office though, this is another little cottage on a property, well, same landholders, but on the other side of the road. And you'll see the wall is dry stone in the sense that it's, it's giving the game away, isn't it? I was warned that this has a very active trigger. Okay, I think I've got it. Okay, so no mortar. What they have used is lime plaster just to keep the weather out. Now obviously when the roof blows off, then the weather gets in and the plaster frets away and it exposes what's underneath, which of course is quite beautiful, that dry stone wall. And this is a wonderful property with several kilometres of dry stone fencing, as well as this little old cottage and this, which was a draft horse stable. And you can still see some of the post and rail fence that was originally part of that structure. That wall is probably best part of 3 metres high. It's extraordinary. And it's ramrod straight and shows no sign whatever of buckling or bending at all. So the craftsmanship was really quite extraordinary to build something like that, which was so durable. Not every dry stone wall, just because it was old, was well built, but these ones which have survived pretty much intact were obviously built with a great deal of skill. This is on a property at Mount Pleasant, and it's an old well. What you can see is actually the well head. And it's obviously been damaged, probably by livestock or maybe machinery, whatever. It's quite a large well. It's probably 4 metres across and about 6 metres deep. And it's on the property Rosebank, which is probably well known to some of you. And Gus McLaughlin has 4 of these wells on the property, fairly close to the homestead, and they provided water for the homestead. And he agonised over it and said, really, I can't leave it like that. This really needs to be repaired. Difficult job. Even just pulling the old one down is a difficult job without losing the stone into the well. But he decided to go ahead with it and restored it and a couple of years ago, and that's what it finished up like, which is really beautiful, isn't it? I can point out, hopefully I don't flick through 20 slides when I do this, these stones at the top. This is the traditional way of finishing off a dry stone wall. They're called copestones, and obviously they're arranged on edge instead of flat. And the advantage of doing that is that it holds the wall together. This is actually a pair of walls. There's an outside skin and there's the inside skin, and these bridge across the two of them and hold it together. And being on edge, all the weight is borne on a fairly small area, and so therefore it's a very high pressure. If they were laid flat, the weight would be distributed over a much larger area, and therefore the pressure wouldn't be as great and the walls wouldn't be as stable. So that's a very traditional way of doing it. You will see many of the dry stone walls in the UK, for example, have these copestones on top. Where the copestones have been knocked away by livestock or whatever, then the wall generally deteriorates pretty quickly. Another interesting thing about dry stone walls, this is out east of Eden Valley, and there was a fire out there, a big bushfire in 2013. I think it took in something like 30,000 hectares, so it covered a huge area. And Kristen and I, because we were farming up that way at the time, came out to help because we knew the people who owned this particular property. It was part of the Keynes property. We came out to help mop up after the fire, as you do, mainly putting out burning stumps and burning fence posts and so forth. And we came to this, which showed the fire had burnt right up to the fence, the wall, if you like, and that's where it stopped. Now, you might say, well, it probably stopped because there was nothing much to burn on the other side, and that's true. But the issue really is that if you just got an ordinary grass fire, these dry stone walls do have a very important function, even today, in terms of arresting, not putting out, but arresting the fire. It gives an opportunity for the CFS to get in front of the fire front, put out the erratic burns and so forth, and stop that. So it is a case, even if you're not interested in heritage, there is a case for maintaining these dry stone walls because they can, in fact, help control the fire. This was something which was pointed out by George Goyder during the 1860s drought up through the mid-north, where he was trying, or he encouraged the government to themselves encourage pastoralists to start building fences. And he said, if you've got stone, build a stone fence, because not only will it contain the stock and protect your watering points and so forth, it will also stop a grass fire. It took a long time for us to learn that lesson, though. This is just a little ruin. It was an old shepherd's hut up near Tarlee. Now, when I say it was a shepherd's hut, that's my guess. It was just a little cottage, quite isolated from any other domestic buildings and so forth, presumably occupied by a shepherd. And the early means of keeping animals under control and so forth was by shepherds up until about the 1850s, when, of course, the shepherds decided they would head off to Ballarat and see if they could find their treasure underground. So these old remnants, there are not many of them left now, are a reflection of the times back in the 1840s, 50s and 60s when shepherds were controlling stock. When the shepherds left, of course, that was the impetus to start building fences, because that was the only way you're going to control where the animals went. This is one which you've possibly seen. It's a little, it's at Watervale, Seven Hills, sorry, it's at Seven Hills, which is near Watervale. And there's lovely stone architecture, all mortared at Watervale. And it's a lovely, one of the first vineyards planted in the Clear Valley was actually at Watervale. And this is a little shrine. I think it's to St. Ignatius. Looks quite cute, but in fact, if you come up close to it, you discover that it's really pretty ragged. These columns on the corner are not locked in, not keyed in with the rest of the wall. Generally, you'd say the quality of the walling is pretty poor. But having said that, it's still standing. It's still standing despite the fact that a limb from a tree has actually fallen on it. And when it was repaired, unfortunately, this section up here was done with mortar, which is quite unnecessary, but nonetheless it was. If you look inside, you find that that's looking inside up at the roof. And it's pretty skillful to be able to build a roof out of timber. It's called a corbelled roof. So it's interesting, it's cute and so forth, but it's not a great example of dry stone walling skill. Now we're heading up to Burra. You'd sort of think that there would be a lot of dry stone walls at Burra. It's just that sort of place, but in fact there's not that much. This is actually on Dead Man's Creek. It's called Dead Man's Creek because the road that crosses there, the bridge, goes to the cemetery. So it's an appropriate name for the creek. That old bridge has now been replaced. It's just been left intact as a historical artefact, but the road was diverted, and the road is probably where I've taken that photograph from. You can see the big red gum bearers which kept the bridge up. Unfortunately, one of them has broken. I'm not sure if you can see it here. I think it's sort of out there. And so that's rendered the whole structure fairly vulnerable. It's the sort of thing you look at it and you think, well, someone should fix that, because once the deterioration sets in, then of course it's on the road to nowhere. And so there is a strong case for spending a bit of money and getting that right. The wall all along the edge there, that's all dry stone. The only bit of mortar is just at the the entrance to that culvert or under the bridge, which is mortared, but the rest of it is all dry stone. So historically it's interesting, not particularly beautiful, but I think it's valuable and something that which probably should be protected because it's quite unique. Now heading up to Port Germain. This is the Port Germain Gorge Road, or otherwise known as the Bangor Road. And it's quite an extraordinary road. It goes from Murrayville at the top down to Port Germain. And Port Germain, of course, had a big jetty. I think at one stage it was the longest jetty in South Australia, probably in Australia. I've got to be careful talking to historians because I might have that a little bit wrong. I know Ardrossan is bigger, but I think Ardrossan came later. Anyway, let's not get too much into the detail because I'll bury myself in that hole. The road itself is really quite beautiful. It winds its way down through a series of crossings, and up until about the 1930s, I think there was something like 35 creek crossings. So it was a very, very difficult road to negotiate, particularly if you're carrying a load, grain or wool, or whatever it might be. Eventually in the 1930s, the road was realigned to some extent. Culverts were put in, some bridges were put in, and it was reduced, in fact, to I think 13 creek crossings. Made the whole thing much easier to navigate, and it was really quite scenic. Some very, very impressive abutments along the side of these roads, not shown in this slide. But then in 2015, I think it was, it's in the book, there was a huge fire called the Bangor, known as the Bangor Fire. It went up through that area. It did an enormous amount of damage to the native vegetation. This was in February, I think, of that year. And then, lo and behold, no sooner had they put the fire out, they being the CFS, but also to some extent it burnt itself out, no sooner did that happen than they had 80 millimetres of rain in an hour. And 80 millimetres of rain, a lot of water came tearing down that gorge and did what you can see. It ripped the road apart and took out a lot of the abutments and so forth. There was talk at the time of saying, well, it's all too hard. Let's not repair it because it's just going to be such a huge effort, and these days it doesn't carry that much transport anyway because Port Germain is not used as a jetty for export. Anyway, wise heads prevailed and they did restore it, and basically DIPTI, Department of Infrastructure and Transport, did a pretty good job. Not perfect by any means. Those sections of dry stone wall which had not been damaged were retained. Other sections were rebuilt, mortared. For the life of me, I don't understand why they didn't dry stone it again, but at least they used the same stone, and the precinct itself has retained its integrity. So I'd say, given that the government did it, apologies to public servants, given that the government did it, they did a pretty good job. It could have been a lot worse. They could have turned their back on it and said, too hard, or they could have done a rough job. They could have backed it up with gabions or concrete sleepers or something like that, but they kept that actual integrity. It looks, as you drive through it, it looks like it used to look. If you get out of your car and have a closer look, then you see all the sins that were committed. So you've got to sort of ask yourself, when is good enough? This is a lovely little cottage which was restored on a property belonging to Michael Burford. Michael's the guy in the red shirt. It was a little cottage on his property near Peterborough, and he knew the story behind this cottage. He employed the chap in the white shirt, Wally Carline, who was a professional dry stone waller, learned his craft in Derbyshire, lots of dry stone walls there, and came out to Australia, settled there and built a lot of dry stone walls. I met him when I was writing the first book because I saw so many walls that he'd built. He was very good, very, very capable. Anyway, Michael came across to him and said, I want you to restore this little cottage, which was built all dry stone. And they spent a week on it, Michael sort of helping him, but Wally was the expert, and finished up with that, which is really quite charming. But what drove Michael to do this was he knew the story. This little cottage was occupied by a single woman who raised 13 children. Not all in this cottage, some, but not all. But she certainly spent part of her life there, raising 13 kids. And Michael felt that such a heroic effort needed to be recognised one way or another, and he decided the best way to recognise it was to rebuild the cottage in her name. And I think full marks to him. Okay, cairns. Cairns are dry stone, generally built by piling rocks on top of each other, and the early settlers, of course, were always into building cairns. This one is Mount St Mungo on Hiltaba Station in the Gawler Ranges. But there are many, many of these cairns built by the early surveyors, Goyder being one, Samuel Parry being another, and many others, not just explorers, but actual surveyors. This one is a bit wonky up top, partly I think because the stake up there had fallen off. And so they had to replace that stake, and in rebuilding that section it was obviously done by a rank amateur, because the rest of the cairn is really very carefully built. And they were meant to be carefully built because they had to endure. And there's many of these cairns, but of course it's a big area up there, and so they're a long way apart. So most people in their lifetime will probably only see one or two. But they're very well built. Some of them are built in a circular section like this one here, others are rectangular, some are even triangular. And I think often the cairn builder wanted to leave their signature in terms of the style of the cairn that they built. This is, I wonder if anyone recognises this, Mount Ive Station, again in the Gawler Ranges. It's called the Embankment, and it has behind it a dam. Now you might say, well, why on earth would you build a dry stone wall to hold water back? Well, the other side of the wall is actually lined. It's all lined with lime mortar and sealed, and there are still piles of burnt lime lying at the base here. The back, which we're looking at, is dry stone. So that's providing all the strength. The waterproofing is on the other side. And it's interesting when you actually see this in the flesh and you get up fairly close to it, you can see that it was actually built by 3 different people because the styles are different. Now, it's probably a bit of a stretch to say 3 different people, probably 3 different teams of people, because there's a lot of work in that, even though there's an abundance of stone lying around, so you didn't have to fetch it very far, but it's still a lot of work assembling it. This is probably something like 4 or 5 metres high, and you can see the different styles that have been incorporated in the build. This is probably the oldest European-built dry stone wall in South Australia, and it's on Point Fowler, and Point Fowler is over at Fowler Bay. Fowler Bay was a whaling station, and it was noted in, I think, 1840 by Eyre. He noted the beach at Fowler Bay was littered with whale bones, and he suspected that it was the American whalers that he had seen at Port Lincoln, which were using Fowler Bay as a whaling station. This is on Point Fowler, which sort of juts out from the bay, and it's a little, what would you call it, dwelling, shelter. And apparently, a bit hard to validate this, apparently they would have observers out there in this little abode, keeping their eye out for the whalers. If the whalers were coming in with a whale, they would send a smoke signal back to shore indicating there's a whale coming in and we need a manpower, in those days it would have been manpower, to do the dirty work on the whale when it was finally beached. Now, whether that's true or just a bit of folklore, I'm not too sure, but these days people go out there and visit that, and they go out mainly to spot whales with their binocular, not with a harpoon, and then they send a radio signal back to the caravan park saying we're coming back and we expect to see a hamburger waiting for us. This is a little dry stone building on another property up in the pastoral district, Witchelina. Witchelina is a property which is managed by the Nature Foundation, and this, I believe, one end of it was an office and the other end was a smithy. And it's all dry stone. There's a shot of the lintel over one of the doors, and there are a couple of other dry stone structures nearby. But it's an interesting place, Witchelina. If you walk to this part of the property, which is called Mount Northeast, if you walk to it along a gorge, name of which eludes me at the moment, there's a huge pile of stone, natural stone, which has just tumbled down off the side of a cliff, and it's sitting there for building. And if you're keen on building dry stone walls, you give anything to have a truck with you to take some of that stone away. But the reason it's still there is a great wall across the gorge which you can't get past in a vehicle, and so that stone has been essentially protected. But generally speaking, they had a lot of stone and could build a lot of stone things. And this is the key, of course. A lot of these stone structures that you see in this pastoral district have been built because that was what was available, the stone. This is a wall at Umbertana. Never sure how to pronounce it. I'm sure there'll be someone in the audience who can correct me. It's either Umbertana or Umberatna, one or the other. And it was built apparently by Afghan cameleers. And it was built, we think, in the 1860s, which is during the drought, when there were very few sheep left and very little wool was being shorn, and so therefore there was just not much work for the cameleers. But apparently the pastoralists wanted to keep the manpower that they had, which is in this case the Afghans, and put them to work and built, in this case, a dry stone wall. It's an interesting wall because it doesn't seem to serve any great function, but perhaps back then it did. Obviously separates one side from the other, but you might say, well, why bother? Anyway, it's interesting. The style itself, I've asked a few people who would be familiar with the walls that Afghans could build, and they don't seem to think that there's anything there to tell a story. This is at Strangways up at Mound Springs, and of course Strangways was a overland telegraph repeater station, and these little repeater stations, it's interesting, they were like tiny little villages. They had to be almost self-supporting. They had to have a little bit of limited livestock, in this case probably goats for milk, sheep for rations and so forth, but you wouldn't grow a crop there because it's just such harsh conditions. But these are pens that the livestock would have been contained in. They're very well maintained given how long they've been there, 170 years probably. But it's a very interesting stone. It's a very gritty stone, which is sort of a limestone, which is very, very gritty, and therefore the friction holds the wall together, keeps it intact. And it's been looked after by the Friends of the Mound Springs. And this is a wall that I have shown previously. It's actually at Kinclarvin Station on the Nullarbor. And you might have seen something about Kinclarvin Station a couple of months ago. It was underwater. There was a big flood on the Nullarbor, and the previous overseer on this property sent me a photograph, and you could only see the roof of the sheds. Imagine that on the Nullarbor. Anyway, this was built by a woman by the name of Barbara Hogg. She and her husband were the overseers on the property, Commonwealth Hill, which is the biggest sheep station in the world, and she built these walls. I found out about this from her mother when I started writing the first book. I put a note in the National Trust newsletter saying I'm writing a book about dry stone walls. If you know anyone, blah, 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 the usual sort of thing. A woman by the name of Kathleen White got back to me and said, yes, my family grew up at Point Sturt. My grandfather built dry stone walls, etc., etc. I've always felt that I had the dry stone walling gene. I wanted to build one, but my husband wouldn't let me because he said they harbour snakes. And as a postscript, she said, but my daughter, who lives at Kinclarvin Station, has built one, and she included a photograph. This is a letter, not an email. I thought, well, that's pretty good. I contacted Barbara and said, I've heard about this from your mum, etc., etc. How did you learn how to build a dry stone wall like that? And she said, well, it was out of necessity, really. She said, I love living out here, I love the wide landscape and so forth, but at the same time I wanted to have a garden. So I had to be able to keep the roos out, so I had to build a dry stone wall. So I looked on the internet and decided the style for me was the Cotswold style. That's what you're looking at the moment, the Cotswold style. Now, if you've ever been to the Cotswolds, you know it's not quite the Nullarbor. Anyway, she sent me several photographs, and she is very, very good at what she did. When the first book was published, I contacted her. I said, Barbara, your photograph of your wall is in the book, etc., etc. And she said, oh, we're leaving the station. We're moving to Narracourt. I said, well, you won't find any stone at Narracourt. What are you going to do for a hobby? And she said, it's all right. The farm we bought has got a quarry. And that's what she's built down at Narracourt. This is only part of what she is superhuman. This is only one of the many, many walls that she's built. They're very high quality and she is massively productive. Building dry stone walls is not just a boys' game, I can assure you. Although historically, most of the dry stone walls were built by men, yes, that's what they did. But certainly not the case now. So just to finish off, no, I thought there was another slide in there. There's not. I run courses on how to build dry stone walls. I do this with another guy who's a professional waller. He's better at it than I am, but between the two of us, we put together a pretty good package. There are always people who want to learn how to do these things. And so this is out at the Rosebank property at Mount Pleasant that I mentioned earlier on when I showed you the photograph of the well. And here we are, a dozen people learning how to build a dry stone wall. You can see in the distance, this is the old dry stone wall. It had been there probably since about 1870, but had been damaged mainly by timber falling on it, the trees which had been growing nearby. And that's what happens if you have trees growing near these walls. So we thought, well, let's have a little workshop where we rebuild a little section of the wall, probably about 10 metres or something like that, for a dozen people. With any luck, the landholder will then say, oh, that looks good, I'll finish it off. But the whole thing runs for about 200 metres altogether. So it was a bit optimistic of me to think that would happen. So I ran that workshop over a weekend, and the people learned how to build the basic structure and so forth. The person in the yellow sleeves is Wally Carline, who I mentioned before. He rebuilt that little cottage near Peterborough. And so he was the instructor. I was the sort of dog's body who organised it. And it was so successful that these people went home and told all their friends, and they wanted to have another workshop. And so for the last 10 years, I've been running these workshops. Wally has since retired, but I have another colleague who's a professional certified dry stone waller. He's the brains behind it, and again, I'm the coordinator, and we keep on building these dry stone walls. That's what that one finished up like. It took, I think, something like 14 workshops to get it to that stage, but it's brilliant. And we went out there for a field day about a month ago and showed some of the people who were involved in that very first workshop. And the beauty of it is it doesn't look as if it's been built by a committee, because they all followed the rules. There are rules for how to build these things, and these rules have been generally handed down in the old country and brought out to Australia. And the wallers were generally regarded as tradespeople, craftsmen, not common labourers, but tradespeople, and that skill was highly respected. So having someone like Wally and later on John as the instructors, we made sure that this wall did look like the original wall. Used the same stone, again, in the same place, in the same style as the original wall had been built. Probably a little bit higher standard because, well, we weren't being paid to do it. We could take our time and so forth. Now that's a wall that I built on our farm, and that's the last thing I saw when we drove out down the driveway for the last time. Since then I've been at the Arts Eco Village in Aldinga, and in 2017 I went to the UK and rode my bike through the Lake District, Yorkshire Dales and the Peak District of Derbyshire, looking at dry stone walls. I did that for a month. It was my bike safari. And one of the things that really captured my attention was dry stone bridges. I just love them. This is at, I think, Lind Cove from memory, and you can see the sheep coming across the top. This is all built dry stone, quite remarkable. So having seen that and several others, and you've really got to hunt them out because they're generally tiny, this is a relatively big one, generally tiny little pedestrian or bridle bridges, often not marked on maps, and often the landholders are not even aware of them. Anyway, I decided I had to have one, so I built that little one at the Arts Eco Village, which I was quite happy with, and so happy in fact that I then built another one. And having built bridges, I thought, well, I'm running out. The trouble is with South Australia being so dry, there are not a lot of creeks that you can build bridges over. So I built a courtyard instead, and this is all stone that I brought with me from the farm. When we left the farm, I came to the village with 20 tonne of stone, which was sort of my dowry. A bit unexpected, I must admit. The village wasn't expecting that, and they said, what are you going to do with it? And I said, well, I don't know, but something might turn up. Anyway, once I built the first bridge, I think people thought he can build things. I said, what about this little courtyard? It's called the winter henge because of the verticals. It's a horseshoe shape, and in fact, if you stand there on the 21st of June, winter solstice, and look out the horseshoe, you'll see the setting sun. And so that whole courtyard next week will get filled with sun at the sunset. And this is another thing which doesn't really have a name. It looks a little bit like the so-called beehives you see on Donald Batman Drive, which shouldn't be called beehives. They're really meant to represent Aboriginal whirlies, and incidentally, they're not dry stone. They look it, but they're not. But this one is a little bit, it's really just a folly. Again, it's just using up the last of the stone which I brought with me from the farm. It's solid, not hollow, and it's meant to be part of this overall thing. You can see it there in the distance, and the other members of the family are here. So this is, some people say this is an egg, and it's just hatching this, which is going to come over here and join the rest of the family in due course. The other interpretation is this thing is actually gobbling that one up, and the others are just sitting there terrified, petrified, waiting for their turn. And this is the last thing that I built. Again, trying to use stone which had been used elsewhere in the village, not introduce more textures. So you can see these, that quite a, these cobbles got quite a story behind them. The vertical monoliths and the slate, because all the slate from Wollonga, the Wollonga quarries and so forth, is quite widely used in the village. And just the last thing to say before I wrap up, these cobblestones, they shouldn't be called cobblestones, but in the village they call them that. I'll take you back to the bridge because it's a better representation of it. These were actually the pavers for the sheep yards at Jepps Cross. Remember when there used to be an abattoirs and then sale yards at Jepps Cross? All moved out 20 years ago. But the sheep yards, which covered many, many acres, were all lined with these cobblestones. And they all came from Victoria, because there was a big quarrying industry in Victoria. The myth, the folklore down at the village where I live is that they all came out as ballast in ships. Well, that's a bit of a stretch to think that something like that would happen. In fact, Richard Morovic, who wrote the history of the Jepps Cross abattoirs, validates the fact they all came from Victoria, 500,000 of them. And when the abattoirs were closed down, all the infrastructure was auctioned off, and the village in its wisdom bought a lot of them. Not all, but bought a lot of these stones. So there's heaps of them still in the village, and they use them for little things like edging around paths and things like that, and bridges and so forth. So there you go. That's a bit of a potted history of some of the new things which are in my book. That's what the book looks like.